So we are using a silent sound system, so it's a bit like a silent disco. If I'm not talking loud enough, just give me a wave because it's a bit different from usual. So I'm going to try my best. So thank you everybody for coming. This is part of our fossil fuel day at the Panda Pavilion. I just finished a session talking about finance, which was very interesting. We were joined by someone to talk about Norway, by somebody from the Ministry of Finance in Brazil. For this session, we want to talk about more on the kind of policy regulation side of stuff, so shifting from planning to action when we talk about fossil fuel phase out. Some of you may already be aware of some of the work that we've been doing in WWF with the support of Climate Focus. We started to explore what we can do to support governments exploring these elements. So what can we do to support them explore the type of policy and governance and legislation that they want to put in place to help them implement their NDCs? And we have a really exciting panel. It's been a bit of a wild ride, I will say, about getting everybody up here to speak, but I'm really excited. We have an amazing panel with us today. At the moment, we've got 2 panels, but we are expecting more people to come. But I want to, I want to welcome Antonia Scheer, is that right? The Deputy Director of Policy at the Climate Transition Centre, based at the London School of Economics and Political Science. So welcome. And Jonas Kuhl, hopefully I'm getting that right, Senior Policy Advisor, ISD Energy Program, and expert on green fiscal policies. So welcome, guys. We will also be joined by, I see him coming, it's Shady. Perfect timing. Where do you want to sit? Yeah. Shady Khalil, a Senior Global Policy Strategist at Oil Change International. Include some of his experience working on the UNFCCC, processes under UNEP, but also at the national level in Egypt. So really rich panel. So welcome everybody and thanks for joining. It's all good? It's Channel 9, that helps. Yeah. So guys, bear with us. It's been a challenging time to organize events and we're going to make it even more challenging. What we wanted to do was to try a bit of a Mentimeter to get things started. So Jess is going to put it up on the screen. We wanted to ask you guys to give some ideas on what would you say is the biggest barrier, is that me, to countries in phasing out fossil fuels? So any ideas on this? And maybe you've used Mentimeter before, just it's menti.com and the number is 1198-7507. I'm going to give you a minute or so to do that. Let me know if you want me to read out the number again. Just give me a wave. I should have told you guys to take your phones up on the panel. I will ask you about it next. So it's okay. Okay, so while you're doing that, I think I'll kick us off. It's working? Maybe? I'll kick us off maybe with some questions going. So very welcome to hear your thoughts on what you think the biggest barriers are, but I'm going to also kick off with the first question. I'm going to turn to you first, Nina. From your perspective, what does peer learning look like from an NDC implementation perspective and thinking about fossil fuel phase out specifically? And who are the type of countries or actors that we can look to lead us on this?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shirley. Is that all right? Can you hear me? Perfect. Thank you. So I'm very happy to be here today. I'm coming from the TPI Global Climate Transition Center. We're a research center at the LSE, and we assess companies, countries, and banks on how they're doing on the climate transition, looking at their targets, looking at their specific policies. And we provide this data for investors so that they can take that into account in their decision making. A really important assessment we have for countries is around fossil fuel phase-outs, and this is why this panel today is so important. The International Energy Agency have found that to align with 1.5 degrees, we don't need any new oil and gas production. We don't need any new coal mines. Is that here? Maybe that's somewhere else. It's not here. Okay, thank you, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, great. And that's a really, really important baseline. Investors need to understand that. Governments and companies all need to understand that. There's obviously immense barriers in the way, mostly economic ones. Any individual company, any individual country has a lot of economic potential, they believe, from exploiting oil and gas. However, that economic case is very weakened if we start to look at how oil and gas demand will eventually plateau and fall. I think it's really just a question of when, but it will happen. And there's been analysis of Colombia, one of the leading countries in this area, who has committed not to issue new licenses for oil and gas. That's really the leadership that we want to highlight, because that's a country who has not yet industrialized completely. There's still a lot of development challenges, but that's the kind of leadership we need to see on climate. It's also economically rational if you believe the transition will happen, which I think most of us here, we know it will happen. It's just a matter of how fast and exactly when. So in terms of peer learning, what I wanted to raise, in addition to that example of Colombia, is we assess countries. We have these indicators I mentioned about phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and committing to not approve new licenses. There's one country I wanted to raise, which is Portugal. They have set a ban on new oil and gas exploration, which they have potential resources around their territory, and they have decided not to exploit that. They've also disclosed their fossil fuel subsidies transparently and have a commitment to phase them out. So peer learning, what we have in the ASCOR tool, this is a tool that allows investors to engage with countries on these policies as bondholders, so as sovereign bondholders. This is why investors want this kind of information. And they understand that leaning into oil and gas, leaning into fossil fuels presents transition risks. That's what I was raising earlier. And to kind of close this point on peer learning, what I wanted to raise is 3 alliances that have mostly all been born at COPs. And these are the Powering Past Coal Alliance, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, and COFIS, which is the Coalition on Phasing Out Fossil Fuel Subsidies, Incentives Including Subsidies. That's COFIS. These are all opportunities for countries to peer learn. So you have a group of leaders who come out, they want to move faster than the rest of the parties here at COP, and they come together and they build a coalition and they build ways to learn from each other and move things faster. So that's a really exciting mechanism that we have here at the COPs, where the negotiations are all by consensus. That often means you have the lowest common denominator, but at the same time there are these initiatives. We'll hear from IISD, I think, who are the secretariat for COFIS, and that's really an important part of this journey.
And I would say, sort of coming from the previous session, you're saying a lot of what I'm hearing elsewhere, and mentioning some of these coalitions I think is really great, because what we're looking for is an injection of momentum, right? Especially now that we have this gap in the NDCs, and I think this is something which would be really interesting to consider in COP30 is, how can we challenge countries to think specifically about paragraph 28, about phasing out fossil fuels, and who can champion on that. So I think this is really timely. Jonas, let's turn to you. Thanks so much for joining. Subsidies is I'm hearing that coming up everywhere, and there's a reason that we're not really pushing forth on the phasing out of subsidies as fast as we would want. So I think it's a really critical element. So from your perspective, what are some of the governance elements that you'd like to see countries explore to try to get over these barriers for phasing out subsidies towards fossil fuels?
Well, thank you so much. I just also test. You can hear me well? Okay, perfect. I'm very happy to be here. Just for those who don't know, ISD, we are the International Institute for Sustainable Development. We have worked on fossil fuel subsidies for quite a long time. So we have a global subsidies initiative, and it just celebrated its 20th anniversary. We don't want a 40th or 30th. So we do hope that there will be a lot more incremental progress on that issue. So um, I think generally subsidies are coming up everywhere, I believe. Like we have them in SDGs, we have them at the G7, at the G20, in APEC, we had them at the GST and also in other cover decisions before. Just because, I mean, from the outset, it is very clear that these subsidies have to be phased out and reformed because they're very clearly in the way of the transition away from fossil fuels. So I think what we saw and what we are very happy and what we consider also achievement over these years is that there is this commitment. So there's this commitments everywhere. What we don't see so much is actually the implementation. So I mean, we did have an energy crisis that ballooned in numbers, but nevertheless we are talking about 1.8 trillion in 2022, still over 1 trillion in 2023. So these are massive numbers. And that is definitely a barrier for the transition away. So I think what I wanted to share a little bit today is that we from ISD have been doing some work over the past year that is actually of like, how can you operationalize a little bit this commitment? Because, I mean, just having the commitment of phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, we clearly see it wasn't really working. So from our perspective, we were looking at a more practical, more realistic approach to actually achieve some of the impacts. So we have been working on a framework which is not out yet, but it will come out maybe tomorrow actually. So it's in the very, very final bits of process. But actually looks at how can governments make progress to phasing out subsidies. So it is a lot of question about the prioritization. So I mean, if you just look at subsidies, it's quite complex. They can have very different forms, very different. They look at coal, they look at oil, they look at gas. So it's quite complex. There's very different, also very different views from industries. Then you look at vulnerable groups. So we were looking at an approach that is realistic and that is very practical. So from our perspective, we were considering kind of like a framework that looks at 3 aspects that when phasing out fossil fuel subsidies that are not impacted. So the one aspect that's coming up is energy security, which we always hear fossil fuels are needed for energy security. We don't buy into that. We know a lot of reasons why they are not supporting actually energy security, and that's why also fossil fuel subsidies don't. The second part is, of course, impacts for social, for economic aspects, but also environmental. So in some contexts, we have subsidies that help remove from using biomass for cooking, for other aspects, which would clearly be worse than having like a cleaner cooking fuel. So that's a question. And the third question is about, of course, and we have seen that a lot in different countries, whenever, or in many cases, when there's discussions about phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, we see protests and we see the political aspects. So our approach is also, of course, considering that part. And in that way, the framework basically sets out kind of like 3 different categories of how we can prioritize and how we can classify fossil fuel subsidies. So really those that can go very quickly, is like within a year even. You just need to make easy legislative changes to them. So that would be one. That would mean a lot of like what you just mentioned, subsidies that still support new oil and gas exploration, new extraction of fossil fuels would be in this. But also things like there's still subsidies that support like luxurious elements, like private jets, fuels for private jets, things like this. So we believe there's a couple of subsidies and that fall into this category where there is not a big impact. There won't be a big political backlash, and this is definitely not needed for the short-term energy security. So this is the first bucket. A second bucket is then the more harder ones. So where we know that usually those are like subsidies that go to everyone. So if you just phase them out, then there will be some critical parts of the society that that will be impacted, and that will be impacted hard, and it will be very difficult for those to secure their continued access to energy and to secure their livelihoods. So that would be blanket reductions of energy taxes or when fuels are cheap for basically artificially being cheap for everyone. So things like this is where we believe it requires a lot more work. So it requires like a plan. So you need to have all these like things like consultations, really looking at how can you mitigate the impacts on vulnerable consumers, how can you find ways of transitioning away for these consumers. So this is the second bucket. And then we have a third bucket where we believe that these are actually still needed, at least for the short term, for the longer medium term. More like looking at like 4 to more years. And those are things where we know that in some areas, like very remote communities, you need some, like the renewables don't work there yet. Like if we're talking about an area near the Arctic where it's half a year, it's very dark. For example, you can't put up a solar panel there. So until we have like more sustainable fuels or other ways to ensure access in these regions, those would be subsidies we would consider that they should be exempt and they should continue for a certain while. But on the other hand, this should not be just like a blanket way of not having any reform, but it should be like, it should be keeping the subsidies while still making progress to get these alternative fuels like biogas, for example, etc. So we believe like this type of framework would make it way more realistic, more pragmatic, and it actually achieves some form of reforms in the short term, which we have been lacking. And we believe if once the ball is rolling, we believe there's many many benefits of actually phasing out subsidies. So that will be a good first step. And we believe once this is going, the more difficult ones will also follow that approach. So I'll keep it for this for the moment.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thanks, Jonas. That was really great. I think this is also something that we think is really important. I mean, subsidies is such a difficult one, and I think from our perspective, we don't really want to be imposing how to do things. So I like the structure that you gave, that there's various elements that can be done across time, which can think about what are the challenges and how we can overcome them sort of over time. So this is not just you phase in, you phase out. It's a process that we need to think about, which is really great. Shady, we're going to turn to you, but I am just going to welcome Amanda to the stage. Thank you for joining us from the NDC Partnership. Amanda's here as the Director of Knowledge and Learning with the NDC Partnership Support Unit, but the NDC Partnership is doing a lot of really interesting stuff thinking about the next step in terms of implementation. So we're really excited to have you here. So thanks very much for joining. Why don't I go to Shady first, and then we can come to you, Amanda. So OCI does a lot of work to develop relevant research on communication, and I think Jonas talked a little bit about this as well, about making sure that the transition is something which it works for people, it's something that's accepted, and that's something that definitely needs some additional resources for. And OCI does work on this. It also does bridging between decision makers and civil society, so making sure that everybody gets a chance to speak. Why is this so important to overcome the barriers? And what kind of research and strategy do you think is still needed or could be helpful to further this?
Thank you so much, and I'm very happy to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. And also for people here who might not know OCI, we work on communication, data, and research, and as you have mentioned, we try to show the true cost of fossil fuel. And how a just transition can be enabled everywhere. And I think the component of justice here is very important for us, and this is where we keep our focus. So our focus is mainly on the element of public finance and how can it unlock the transition. And I think most of our research work unlocks this part of the public finance, and this is why it's very important. So we look into the role of public finance and how the management of public finance is actually not going into the right direction, and how countries, and specifically historical polluters, global north countries, do have the money. The money is existing over there, but it's not actually being channeled to support global south countries to transition. And many of our research and data, for whoever is exposed to our research, would know this in terms of like numbers and figures. And also, for example, one of our latest research focused on the role of private finance. So for every, because sometimes it's being sold as the magic bullet, right, as a solution to the transition, but it's actually not So for every promised $7 that's going to go to private finance, actually one end up going towards this direction. So it's really inequivalent to solve the solution or actually take us anywhere we want to go. So the role of public finance is one of the key elements that we focus on. And this also speaks to the global piece within the COP specifically. So within the financial goals that we didn't receive last year is actually impacting the barriers towards the implementation of NDCs today. So many countries without this public finance being put and available for them to transition away from fossil fuel will not be able to do so. And the entire financial architecture, the global one, is actually not allowing countries from the global south to transition, and this is by design, it's not by coincidence. So when we look at the role of multilateral banks, for example, and how it keep investing into projects that actually develop more dependencies for countries on fossil fuel, and even the debt situation when it comes to countries, for example, on the dependency on fossil fuel. So really, and I'm glad that you brought the case of Colombia. So Colombia being indebted in fossil fuel and taking this bold role, is the financial architecture actually rewarding Colombia? No, the credit score of Colombia keep dropping. It's more expensive for them to be able to borrow at this point, and they are going to be more and more indebted, and their economy is more vulnerable to this. So the question here, how are we working in order to create a financial architecture that can reward countries to phase out of fossil fuel, can enable the NDCs to be implemented, specifically in the case of global south countries. So looking into this component I think is quite key, and it's quite crucial when it comes to this. Debt cancellation is an integral piece, I would say, to the NDC implementation, and the entire financial architecture is key in this case. And the second part is around the historical responsibilities and the role of the global north specifically. So our latest analysis shows that from 2013 to 2023, 40% of the expansion around the production is coming from global north countries. So global north countries are really expanding when it comes to the production around fossil fuel and the emissions around fossil fuel. And this is only coming from 4 global north countries. So we're speaking about the US, Norway, Australia, and Canada. So only 4 global north countries. And when you look at the entirety of the world, it's actually dropping the production by 2%. So even countries like Saudi Arabia, let's ignore the negotiation dynamics. But if you look at their production is actually dropping. Does this mean that they are not planning to expand? They are planning to expand. But the data and the number for who's responsible for the ambition gap that we are seeing right now, it's global north countries, how they are acting, what signals they are sending, how their NDCs are actually reflecting this ambition is quite key. So them taking the lead, as the Paris Agreement say, as the COP here say, and as the agreements that all the countries agreed to say, they need to take the lead. This need to be delivered with their NDCs. And this take us to this COP and why it's important when it comes to the ambition gap. So agreeing on a process that can actually take this COP to discuss timelines, to discuss the equity of the transition and the enabling condition is quite key here. We don't see this among the formal negotiated process, but there is an opportunity for the presidencies, there is an opportunity for many parties. So Colombia has a declaration actually on taking this conversation even beyond the UNFCCC of how countries can come together, agree on schedule, agree on enabling condition, and create this environment that can enable NDCs to be implemented. Because we don't want to come to another assessment, to another census report, and we say, oops, we didn't meet the targets that we are hoping for, and then this will be a disaster for so many impacted community and existential disaster for countries. So I agree on the idea of like looking into governance, looking into how it can be implemented on a domestic level, but we really need to think how can we unlock the global financial architecture also and also the international policies and mechanisms that can enable this transition.
Thanks, Shady. I mean, I think that's a great segue, but I do want to pick up on what you were saying. I think there's definitely a challenge to be made for certain countries to really get down and just do stuff. I mean, that was very clear in the last panel we had, that Brazil is putting a lot of financial mechanisms in place to try and facilitate transition, whereas, you know, Norway is really taking a step back from this. And I think we really need to say we want to see implementation from these developed countries. So I think that's a really important point. And I like what you said about, this needs to sit outside of the UNFCCC a little bit. And I think it'd be interesting, I think, also to hear from Amanda on this, because the NDC partnership hears from countries on what they need. It's that bottom-up process, right? And I think that's a really good, mechanism to see what countries want to see. Especially the ones who want to take the step forward. So I'll turn to you, Amanda. We know, as Shady said, NDCs have got a long way to go. Fossil fuel phase out in NDCs has a long way to go. But what trends are you seeing from your perspective on what type of support they'd like to see, including from fossil fuel phase out, but related sectors that you think are relevant? And I'll give you this mic.
Thank you. And can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you. And it's really helpful context because the NDC partnership, we are working very much outside the negotiating process. And our core focus is supporting developing countries to plan, implement, finance their NDC commitments. And one of the things I wanted to share to start is just as we look at the NDCs that have been submitted already, I know that there's a long way to go in terms of ambition, but one of the positive things that we're seeing is that they're more actionable than they have been in previous cycles. And this is firsthand knowledge that we're hearing from countries. They've taken more time to develop their NDCs because they're doing more complete costing processes, laying out the investment needs, mapping mechanisms for sectoral transitions, and then really important, integrating this into implementation and investment plans to really fast-track the implementation of the NDC. And this is helping in a few ways, but one that I think is really relevant is through that process, countries are engaging different ministries and stakeholders in the process and building more institutionalized processes to carry them along in the implementation as well. And I think when we look at fossil fuel phase out, this is absolutely critical because of the implications it has across sectors, the implications it has across society. We are about to adopt, hopefully, fingers crossed, on Saturday our next work program for the next 5 years, for 2026 to 2030. And something that we're really focusing on within that work program is sort of getting back to basics on NDC implementation. What does it mean? Because right now it means everything. And this is fantastic because countries are looking at all different aspects. They're looking at the linkages across sectors. They're looking at topics they hadn't looked at before, including fossil fuel phase out. And what we've realized through our engagement, and none of this will come as a surprise, but this is what I mean by getting back to basics, is that there's certain core, what we're calling building blocks, that are really critical for countries to have in place in order for the support that is provided to be impactful. And there are two sides of this that I wanted to highlight. The first one is on what we call country building blocks. And so these are the conditions for countries. And it starts at the highest level of political ownership. And I think when you're talking about a topic as tricky and as embedded as fossil fuels, having that ownership is non-negotiable. You can't make this transition without having that ownership. And so part of what we're doing is working with countries to understand what it is that they need in terms of institutional strengthening processes that can help empower them in that and create these lasting processes and systems. The second part is about ambition. And so not just an ambitious NDC, but actually ambitious implementation plans, investment plans, and again, thinking about what are the core steps that are needed to achieve these really ambitious goals. And then the third building block is around capacity and transparency, but capacity first and foremost, because in order for these transitions to be sustainable and lasting, we cannot just rely on outside support. That support needs to be building up that institutional knowledge to take that work forward. And this is matched on the partner side because countries should not be expected to do all of this alone. There's support that's needed. But the building blocks that we're working with our partners on, and this includes WWF, which is why I'm so excited that you're now looking at this topic and can be an important support provider here. But again, it's that the high-level ownership and really championing these issues. It's ensuring that there is sustained committed capacity to actually engage in country-owned processes, and so taking the cues on what it is that countries are prioritizing and targeting your support around that. And then the third one is around having consistent finance and support. And again, when we're talking about transformational changes, these are not possible with piecemeal project-by-project support. So I'll leave it at that for this first round, but just to kind of illustrate, I know that none of this is unique to fossil fuels, but this is really the approach that we're taking across all of the work, and I think really will help to push forward some of these critical agendas like the one we're talking about today.
Thanks, Amanda. And I think this has been a really good setup for kind of just to talk a little bit about what we're doing with some of the partners in the room here. It's great to see so many familiar faces, and I think it's really building on the direction that the NDC partnership is going. Like Amanda said, we really need to kind of be promoting these country-owned processes. And so definitely a question for us is how can we support countries? How can we support them in a way which is sufficiently nationally specific, but also is enough to sort of share the learning. And Nina gave us some really great examples of some of the learning out there. So that's some of the elements that we're looking at. We've been developing this idea of a policy toolkit, which we've already been implementing in the food sector. So like Amanda said, it's not just the fossil fuel sector, but it is worth looking at it in specific contexts. And we are currently looking at it from the fossil fuel perspective. And I think our learning from doing it in the food sector was that finance was so important, and that's what you said, Shady, and Jonas as well, and subsidies have to be a really big element of this. So I'm delighted to say that we've picked up on a lot of the elements here. We will have our primer published on the website soon, so you can have a look at it, but I think that what you can take away from the first round is that we're all very much going in the right direction, in the same direction. And it's great to hear that the NDC partnership is also going to be sort of promoting and taking the lead on this. So we'll be delighted to support on that. I'm going to move us to the second round of questions. And maybe we'll go this way again, but you're now here, Amanda, so I might go right back to you. So one of the things that our primer is doing, like I said, is we want to provide countries with the opportunity to see what type of instruments they can put in place, but not do it in a prescriptive way, because I think we really need to uphold this idea of nationally determined pathways, and I think we can engage in different ways to engage and have that discussion with countries, but I think we want to give them all the options. So that's what we're suggesting is non-prescriptive advice to countries on how to transition away from fossil fuels. From your experience in the partnership and from what you're seeing, what are your thoughts on how to go around like testing and engaging this with countries? And is this the type of thing that you also hear from countries that they want to see on their side? It's also very useful for us to hear on that.
No, this is great, and I think this type of non-prescriptive guidance is exactly the way to go. No country is the same. And I think that every situation is going to require something different. So something that I would suggest, and we've had success in this as well, is thinking about not just the ideas of what can be done, but giving examples of how it's been done or how some of those issues have been tackled, and actually pinpointing some of the first steps that can be taken. We are actually working really closely with BOGA, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, right now, and they have a BOGA fund where they deploy support for implementation. But they recently, last year actually, we launched an NDC window for that fund, and the idea was to get countries integrating fossil fuel phase out into their NDC. We're now a year in to that collaboration, and I can tell you not many countries have integrated it, and it was a really challenging process to get started. And so what we're doing now is we're actually thinking about how countries can take even those small commitments they have in their NDCs and carry them forward. But all that to say that it is really those first steps, that technical analysis, building the evidence base, understanding how this can be communicated to different ministries, different parts of society, the costing. Those are the elements that can be really helpful to bring weight to an agenda, to help our focal points in ministries to promote it, to carry it forward. And while it can seem small and non-impactful, it is actually what we see kind of the most important thing that can be done to really move those agendas forward nationally. So that would be my suggestion, to think about sort of the concrete things that countries could action through the toolkit as well, and even linking them to some of the resources and support that are out there. And that was something that we would be more than happy to collaborate and work with you on.
Thanks so much, Amanda. And I think, I mean, there's a lot in there, but I think you're right. I mean, this is the challenge with NDCs is, you know, the measure of impact is what you see in the NDC, but actually some of the work that we've done over the past couple of years has been the same, you know, engaging with governments on how to get fossil fuel phase out in NDCs, and maybe that doesn't happen for NDCs 3.0, but with the report that we get back from the people who are working directly with the government is making a difference. So it's all part of a broader process, and similar to the way your strategy is going, our theory of change is really, okay, let's support on the implementation so we can circle back to the ambition and really do like a sort of ratchet, I suppose. We'll go back to the ratcheting when we come back to that. I think that's a really, this is going great for me because it's a great segue to Nina, because you were talking about some of the examples there. And I'm really happy that you're here to talk about just transition, because this is such an important underlying element. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about some of the risks and opportunities for the transition. What should countries be prioritizing? And when we're thinking about supporting countries on this, how can some of the ways that we can pick up on that and make sure we're doing it in the right way?
Thanks for that. No, I think I've heard a lot of really helpful points, and I wanted to pick up on a few of them. But maybe I'll start with answering your question. I think it's really important for just transition to define what we mean, because many different players in this space, especially in the COPs, but also all over the world, they take different definitions. So there's kind of two broad ones that I would put forward, and I think we can take them forward in different types of conversations, different types of learnings. So one is the just transition that generally global north countries talk about. They're talking about the just transition domestically. When we stop producing oil and gas, when we phase out fossil fuels, how is that going to impact low-income communities, vulnerable communities, workers, and labor unions? So that's one type of just transition, and I have a few observations to make there. There's another definition, another approach to just transition, which is the wider international climate justice perspective. And that's also really important. And I think what Shady was explaining is exactly that, that idea. So that's common but differentiated responsibilities. Global north industrialized countries should be taking on more of the burden for mitigation, so that countries in the global south who have not yet industrialized have a chance to develop. And they need support to be able to do that. So maybe just diving in first, and before I dive in, I wanted to separate two other things, which is fossil fuel phase-outs. There's a lot in that package. There's a lot in that phrase. And so far on the panel, we've talked about two types of phase-out, and they're different and they take different tools. One is phasing out the subsidies, which can be subsidies to the producers of oil and gas or subsidies to consumers, and those have different challenges. Subsidies to consumers, everyday people, there are important just transition aspects there on that domestic front. And then there's the phase out of production, which is, I think, a lot more politically challenging, but equally important, if not more important. And again, this should be led by global north countries. So I'm going to link all of these four categories to talk about Alberta. So I started my academic career researching Alberta, how jobs in Alberta, which is a province in Canada where we exploit, I'm from Canada, I'm not from Alberta, but we exploit in Canada oil sands. You're also from Canada? I'm from Alberta. Amazing. Great to meet you. Well, you'll have more amazing. So what I was researching there was, because there's great data in Canada, we have lots of statistics about employment. So I was looking at the relationship between jobs in Alberta and oil price changes, international oil price changes. And because Alberta, the oil and gas we have there is actually quite expensive to extract. So we're at the high end of the cost curve, which means that when oil prices fall, production is quite elastic and it usually falls, and that means jobs are lost. So there's a precarity in these jobs, and that's an important message to carry through to all other countries who are potentially considering the potential prosperity that you might get from oil and gas, to be careful. There's precarity in that. There's a lot of volatility in that market. And that's not just oil and gas workers. We actually were able to look at construction workers, general construction workers, even accommodations, people who work in the accommodations and food sector. Their jobs were correlated with oil price fluctuations. That's a lot of precarity across your economy. And that's an important message that I wanted to study, because that is a key way to get global north countries to reconsider their oil production, is to make the case that you can have prosperity, you can build more stable economies if you make a plan to transition slowly in a measured way from oil and gas production. It's absolutely necessary. I think on that, the only thing I wanted to add was thinking about fossil fuel subsidies and the coalitions that I mentioned earlier. Those are all voluntary coalitions. And there's one that I wanted to mention, which is a recent agreement. It's called the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability between Iceland, Costa Rica, New Zealand, and Switzerland. And that is actually a treaty. It's not a voluntary agreement. It's a treaty that, in a sense, is legally binding, that these countries will be phasing out subsidies. So it's kind of bringing an even another level of ambition to those countries who are ready to move in that direction, and learning from those countries, building on that experience should be energizing for all of us. Thanks.
Thanks, Nina. And I like how you're coming back to these, groups who are making, coming together on a voluntary basis, or like you said, exploring different ways. I think that's part of this whole innovation element that we're looking for, right? We talked a lot about innovative financing mechanisms, but I think we also need the innovation and the, just testing things. As long as we're all going in the right direction, I think we can pull things together, and there's been some great work done there. Jonas, we turn to you. Maybe you can expand on what Nina was saying about the subsidies, because I think, how can we support this just transition? How do we look at the interplay between what's needed to push the subsidies as well as what's needed on the just transition side? And what type of governance elements do we need to steer subsidies in the right direction at the right pace?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And I will, before I go what Nina was saying, I'm coming back to what Amanda was saying, because it's actually what we, like you mentioned, this coordination across the ministries. And I think that is particularly a relevant topic also for phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. So when we look at it, and when we look at strategies that countries can and should take, then kind of setting up this institutional framework of actually addressing and looking at identifying what are the subsidies, which ones would be prioritized, etc. And on that angle, I mean, in most cases, fossil fuel subsidies are not there just because, I don't know, to support the industry. It's usually, in many cases, it's a social policy in the lack of actually a social policy. So countries are using it to protect the poor from high prices, while also while doing this, a lot of money to people that actually don't need it. And going through fuels is maybe not also the best way to do it. So that's an example. So you would also need, if you transition away and you phase them out, you would need to find better social policies, and that then needs to bring the labor, social ministries into this discussion. The other ones, of course, is the finance, then the energy. We've been talking about access. So in certain cases, you need to, at least temporarily, very likely, still use fossil fuel subsidies to ensure access to certain types of energy for certain groups. So all of these will require a framework where these ministries and representatives are coming together. It does not only need them. There's also, of course, it also needs to include the social partners like trade unions, other civil societies. We're talking about production subsidies, then it's of course also actually businesses and industries where workers would be highly impacted from this. So, and we have seen this in a couple of countries. So for example, Austria is now carrying out exactly such an approach where countries are, where they are setting up this working group among the relevant ministries. There is non-political advisory body that provides the information like in a non-biased way of all the data that is required, and there is kind of like this broader civil society advisory body that gives that shares also their opinions on what could be ways forward for certain types of phasing out certain types of subsidies. So generally, if we look at country-specific cases, then that is what we think is an ideal approach. Often we see one ministry is just doing a plan without coordinating with other ministries, and then it is shelved and we don't hear about it anymore, and there's a lot of resources that's been lost. So the earlier and the more coordinated this approach will be, the better and the more success we can see. We have, Amanda also mentioned the high level. We have seen also for subsidies in certain places, it was even high on election campaigns. I think we had a case of Indonesia where the president was putting it out and said, like, we are phasing out subsidies to invest it in education and in local development. So those are good messages that help build the support for fossil fuel, for phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. And then maybe a third point, and I have to talk about COFIS, of course, as we are the secretariat. There is this part of like learning from each other. So that is an element that, of course, also is within COFIS, but also in other international forums. So we have there's the Coalition of Finance Ministers, and we know that there's a lot of discussions also happening on the topic there. So generally, I think it is there's interesting approaches, and like now countries are using AI to detect which ones are areas and cities where the wealthier parts, for example, live, and then using that to phase out some subsidies. So there's a lot of innovative approaches where countries can learn from each other on how to tackle and use those, maybe not phasing out all the subsidies, but that's not always the case and maybe not always preferred, but actually removing the very large bits of subsidies that is excessive. And the last point I want to say, because it also has come up, is of course we believe that phasing out fossil fuel subsidies is beneficial for all countries, developed countries, emerging countries, but of course we are aware that the situations are different. And also the types of subsidies are very different in the different countries. In developed countries, we see more very like price controlling. In developing countries, we see more like tax exemptions for specific industries, high emitting industries, to protect them for carbon leakage. So all of this needs to be part of this discussion. Of course, we still see and we think that the leadership must come from developed countries in doing this, but generally there's a benefit of phasing out subsidies in all countries across the globe. So just as a last message also this.
Jonas, and I would say that, I mean, the last part you said is so important, and I'm really looking forward to reading your publication that's coming out tomorrow, because I think like this is one of the challenges about doing a tool which, you know, can appeal to everybody. If you see that countries have other different types of subsidies in place, so that's definitely something to be very careful about and make sure it's relevant to everybody. Also, some of the elements you said there makes me think about the SDGs and how it's so important that that's across the policy-making process. And I know not all countries really focus on the SDGs, but you know, we're in the final 5 years and it's so important. And these elements like energy access, you know, like decent work, all very important. And again, going back to I think what Amanda said, really supporting this idea of institutions working together and making sure there's a clear steer. And I think that's been for me something positive about the NDC 3.0 process, is I've really seen that governments are getting better, or at least in this process that there has been lots of efforts to work across institutions. Certainly things can be improved, but I think it's great to keep this within the vein of NDC implementation, because that's already a movement that's it's moving forward in a positive way, which is really great. And Shady, we turn to you. I think this is a good sort of way to wrap this up from what Jonas said, that when we're talking about national contexts and capacities varying, as we were just talking about in the subsidies element, what type of policy levers and changes do you think are going to be most effective in triggering just an orderly phase out of fossil fuels?
I would say this like broad range of policies, and I mean there are I feel that there's a lot of expertise here on the policy, but like one thing that I can think of specifically as a tool that can unlock finance in that sense are taxes, and specifically taxes to oil and gas companies and their operation, and how those taxes, oil and gas companies make billions every year in profits, not in revenues. They are making so much money while countries are suffering, as you said, like in terms of like social assistance and in terms of inequalities within countries, within the north and within the south, is increasing. So looking into how can taxation actually can unlock financial flows to transition, can actually unlock financial flows to the well-being of economies in terms of how we can work on health, how can we work on education, how can we build industries like renewables, in that sense can be one of the key policies that we can or countries can actually build in order to support and aid the transition. So it's one of the key things that I would say that we envision in terms of the reshuffling of the imbalance globally. So we are looking into mechanisms like the UN Tax Convention, for example, and how can this can help balance the international space when it comes to taxation, but then also on a national level is going to make a huge difference. In this case, is going to create lots of equality and opportunity and chances for development. And then comes also policies specifically around renewables and how can we phase in renewables is actually quite key. So looking into energy access, poverty eradication in terms of energy, because I mean it's a reminder to something that we already all know, that the entirety of the world does not have equal access to energy. The African continent specifically does not have access to energy, let it be to transition. In that sense, the contribution when it comes to the emission is quite fraction to the rest of the world. So like really looking in terms of the equity of the transitioning in, and making sure that this transition in can actually unlock opportunities and investment opportunities to global south countries is actually quite key. Because I mean, let's be realistic. If you're a country in the global south and you have the opportunity, or like an international oil and gas company come to you and promise you the world, they promise you the development and the prosperity, and on the other hand you don't have the technology is being locked in the north when it comes to renewable energy, you would rather go for the oil and gas companies. So technology is quite key when it comes to unlocking the transition and allowing the implementation of NDCs. Patents is quite key. Making sure that transitional minerals, which is quite an integral key for the phasing in renewables, is manufacturers within global south countries, is allowing spaces for development, and reducing the space of inequality is also key in that sense. So making sure that there are domestic policies that allow this manufacturing, allow the transitional minerals, and there are examples of having regulations and laws around this, allowing that we don't reproduce the same extractive dynamics of fossil fuel, but making sure that really transition toward renewables are going to create the prosperity also to the south is very, very important. So I think that's this like combination of making sure that we are able to tax oil and gas companies within the south and within the north in terms to do the social development needed, and then also creating the governance model and the laws that can actually allow countries to benefit from the transition in renewables, and allow communities to be on the table in terms of governance. And this is also, like, I mean, I would say a tricky part when it comes to the implementation of NDCs, because it's not only about governments, it's also about communities and how they also have a place in terms of the implementation on the national level as well.
Thanks, JD, and that's definitely something that we want to make sure is part of it. I think when the work that we did for enhancing NDCs is really important that there is an element of whole of community. So that's definitely something that I think we want to provide the tools to countries to explore. And I really like what you said about, you know, thinking about phasing in renewable energy as well. And if I can say, I think also understanding that there's an element of phasing in renewables as a substitute, as also as really filling the gap on energy access. I think what we're seeing through the NDCs is a lot of the renewable energy is an additional element. So that's why I think it's really helpful to look at things from this perspective. And also to say that I think what's come out of here is that it's really important to look at all the elements, either their finance, the taxation, the subsidies, the production, the consumption side, as well as the trade side. So it's a really complex sort of matrix of elements, and we'd be really keen if anybody wants to be more involved in this conversation with us, because I think there's some really great structures popping up, and I think we really need to try and give something to countries that they can find a way to sort of work their way through all of the asks that are coming to them. So we're pretty much at the end of the session. I think I can be a bit cheeky. If anybody wants to ask a question, we can probably take 1 or 2 questions if there is any at the moment. If you have any questions, then raise your hand and then I can run to you with a mic. Or, yeah?